Welcome to Asia Society for a very special evening with Kishore Mahbubani. It's not the first time he's coming here. This is your, how many times, Kishore, have you been here?
On this
Stop
stage?
counting. But he's
many times.
Many times, but it is certainly my first time sitting here on the same stage with Kishore, and I have to say I'm a little unnerved because he is such a wise, articulate thought leader. And so to be making this a useful hour for him and for you as a moderator and as a conversation partner is a very big challenge, I have to say. But I have taken this challenge because I think the book that he is going to share with us this evening is really worth a read for anybody who is interested in how our world is evolving, how the world as it evolving has very successfully worked on Singapore, a small country but a very successful country that now all politicians, geopoliticians, geoeconomists wants to get a piece of. And so I think under the current circumstances, as difficult as the challenges are, and as plentiful the promises and hopes of the future are, we could not ask for a better speaker to tell us about his story, very much enmeshed in the story of Singapore. So here we have Kishore Mahbubani. And by the way, if you haven't been here for a long time, I'm the new president of Asia Society, and I've been here for about 6 months now. Well, thank you. I read the book. I think many of us have, and then there will be a book signing after this conversation for those of you who also want to get your copy of the book. The book doesn't include any photos, and we thought that was very curious. So we got in touch with Kishore's office and managed to get some photographies of your very rich life of many phases. So Kishore, if I could just ask you, because it's not in the book, to look at these photos and give us a brief explanation of what that is, when that is, and who the people were. So here we go, the first shot.
Okay, first of all, Kyung-Hwa, let me just begin by saying that it's truly a great honor for me that the new president of the Asia Society has chosen me to be the first person that she interviews as president of Asia Society. Yes. So this is a great honor. So if you don't mind, please join me in thanking Kyung-Hwa for this. And this is an easy photograph to begin with because it's clearly my mother on my left, my father, my younger sister, and elder sister. And I must have been about 10 years old because I had another sister born when I was 11 years old. So since she's not in the picture.
She's not there yet.
I must have been 10 years old. Mm-hmm. And this was during probably a Deepavali. You know, the Indian Hindus celebrate Deepavali, the Festival of Lights.
Festival of Lights.
And this is clearly, you can see from the headgear where we are wearing, we probably were attending a Deepavali celebration. Mm-hmm.
I think we said Diwali celebration.
It's interesting. The South Indians call it Deepavali, mm-hmm. and Singapore is mostly South Indian, so they call it Deepavali, but the North Indians call it Diwali.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
This is probably the most significant turning point in my entire life. This is when I got the President's Scholarship in 1967. And the gentleman, the tall gentleman on the right, is the first president of Singapore, President Yusof Ishak. And there I was as I guess, 1967, 19-year-old receiving the President's Scholarship. And if this moment hadn't happened, I wouldn't be here today.
In your book, you said you had no idea how this came about.
Absolutely, I had no idea because the President's Scholarship is given to the top students in the country and you don't apply for it. The Public Service Commission, I guess, studies the results of the top students and then calls them for interviews and then decides to give some away.
And to this day, you don't know who spotted you and who, carried your name through that process still.
Yeah, I wish I knew. I would. The one person I really need to thank is the person who nominated me for this.
Good.
This is my mother. And when I graduated from the National University of Singapore in 1971, and what makes this, I discussed this in my memoirs, what makes this photo interesting is that I did not actually attend the graduation ceremony because I had chickenpox. Because I didn't have chickenpox. So subsequently, I took the graduation gown and took a picture with me and my mother in a studio somewhere, rather than being at the graduation ceremony.
But I have to say, looking at this photo and realizing how young and energetic your mother is, because when you read the book, you get this idea of a very, very hardworking, determined, and rather compared to this young son would be looking rather old, but in this photo you look like almost the same age. Maybe, maybe it's your beard.
Yes, I had many people read my book and seemed to like it, but one person who liked it a lot was Martin Wolf of the Financial Times. He's the chief economics commentator of the Financial Times, and I spoke to him about the book after he read it, and he said, Kishore, you know who's the real hero in the book? I said, who? He said, your mother.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's absolutely true. What I say, if my mother hadn't been as strong, as resilient as she was, because I describe in the book quite graphically the many challenges I faced as a child, because my father was an alcoholic, gambler, went to jail, got involved in fights, and so on and so forth. So it took a very strong, resilient woman like her to bring me to where I am today.
Well, she's done very well. And next?
Next, I think someone everyone in the room knows.
Yes.
President Ronald Reagan, and next to Ambassador Jean Kirkpatrick, who was then the U.S. ambassador to UN. And during the UN General Assemblies, the American president would host a reception for ambassadors, and that's how I got to give a picture of him. But this was in the innocent days when you didn't have all the levels of security that you have today. Today, to try and get near to a U.S. president is a near impossibility because he's surrounded by circles and circles of security. So this is unusual. It shows you things were much more relaxed in the 1980s.
Right. And in those days, it was not many heads of states came as they do these days. It's almost like a must-go place for presidents and prime ministers. Of course, you have them on top of the U.S. security. Their security makes it completely impossible to get around. But I do think that during the 80s, it was the UN ambassadors that represented their countries in these debates that opens up the and I'm not. Is that a good thing or a bad thing that the General Assembly is now an event at the highest levels?
Well, I think it is a good thing, I think, because I think the more I belong to an endangered species called a UN lover. I'm passionately in love with the UN, and I do believe that as we move into a small, interdependent global village, in any village, you need a village council. Otherwise, the village cannot function. So in a global village, we need a global village council. And the role and importance of the UN will grow over the next 20, 30 years, although it is going to have a rough time over the next 10, 20 years.
Very good. Okay.
This is a picture probably taken on my 70th birthday, when actually I did throw a reasonably big party for 200 over people, but then some of my friends traveled from overseas, or all my friends who traveled from overseas came to I think, not in our home, I think it's somewhere else. And on my left is Jeffrey Sung. Those of you who will read chapter 1 of my book will realize that he's my oldest friend. I met him when I was 6 years old, so I've known him for 70 years. And then behind him is Dean Swift, an American who lives in Colorado. He makes a living by stealing tree seeds from squirrels, and he sells tree seeds. He makes a lot of money from it. And he was very generous to me and gave me $2,000 in 1969 to travel to Nepal and to India. And that's Jeffrey's wife, Pim, and then another old friend, Balbir Singh, and on my right is my beloved wife, Anne.
And then she's sitting right there in the front row. Well, I won't ask you how your friend manages to steal seeds from squirrels, but you have many interesting friends, for sure.
This is Foreign Minister Wang Yi of China. He came to Singapore for a meeting, and then I had a discussion with him. This at the Shangri-La Hotel.
This was you when you were...
When I was the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy.
Yeah. Do you remember what you were discussing?
No.
Probably the same issues.
All I can tell you is that he was very diplomatic.
Okay.
This is me with, of course, the most famous Singaporean, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. And on Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's right is someone that many people in New York know very well, Ambassador Tommy Koh. I succeeded him as ambassador to the UN. And he was ambassador to the UN altogether, 13 years, I think. 10
Before
plus 3.
you took over.
Before me, yes. And behind Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, you can only see the top half of his face, is Professor Wang Gungwu, a very famous Asian historian, who was chairman of the board of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. So clearly I was welcoming Mr. Lee Kuan Yew to come to a celebration of the School of Public Policy named after Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. And this is with a New Yorker, Henry Kissinger. This picture was probably taken in October 2022. I came to see him, and we had a wonderful one-on-one conversation lasting on over an hour, where he expressed to me his great concern about the way the Ukraine problem was being managed. He didn't think there was long-term strategic thinking in that problem. But for me, the most interesting part of this session with him, which took place at 5 p.m., was that when they brought in the drinks and the cakes, I said, no, cakes are bad for your health. So I wasn't going to eat my cake, right? I was going to be good, health-free. And then he, at the age then, I think 99, picked up his cake and started eating it. So I said, if a 99-year-old man can eat cake, I'm much younger, I can eat cake too. So I remember enjoying that cake.
Wow, wonderful photo.
By the way, Henry loved his cakes.
And this is, I think, the final picture we have for you.
Yeah, this is a picture of a graduation ceremony at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And I'm seated on my left is the former Prime Minister of Singapore, Mr. Goh Chok Tong, who was the chairman of the board of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy when I was dean. And on my right is President Wahid. He was president of the Maldives. And he was there as a visiting professor. We recruited him as a visiting professor. And in the front row are the faculty members. And then in the last 2 rows are the graduating students, a valedictory dinner of a graduating class. But you can see how diverse the student body is. In the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore, we try to ensure that only 20% of the students are from Singapore, 20% from Southeast Asia, 20% from India, 20% from China, 20% from the rest of the world. So it is one of the most diverse classrooms of any school of public policy in the world. And
I'm sure each and every one of them have gone on to make their marks in their careers in their own countries. So thank you for that brief, I think, overview of your life in photos. But to start off the conversation, Kishore, what struck me most about the book was how brutally honest it was. Usually, memoirs are about events, about the issues that, as a public figure, you were involved in and how it evolved. And the personal side of things is mentioned incidentally. But your book is as brutal on the personal front as the public front. And I found that refreshing, but also very unique. And so is that just a unique temperament that you have, or did you intend it to be so brutally honest because it would make it more interesting?
I think that reflects my culturally confused personality. And actually, I'm quite serious. Because as you know, I'm ethnically Asian. And Asians are culturally programmed to be as discreet as possible. And Asians don't like to use the word I.
Yes.
They never speak about themselves,
Yes.
you know. And they talk about the society. And by contrast, in Western culture, certainly especially in the United States, the individual is the most important. And each one is very open. I find that in my first encounters with Americans, I'd be very surprised where within 5 minutes they'd be telling me their whole life story and how they broke up with their partner last week and how painful it was. And I thought to myself, gosh, no one in Asia would ever be so open. So this is where you have two opposite cultural streaks. And so my book could have been a typical Asian book, which had been very discreet, very polite. But I decided to expose the Western side of my personality. And also because I thought at the end of the day, now that I've turned 75, I realized that I have lived through many layers of human history, right? I was born with a birth certificate that said British subject. Actually, I was more like a British object. You know, in colonial rule, I as an Asian genuinely believed that the white men were superior. I was inferior, you know. And, you know, you cannot explain that sense of cultural inferiority unless you're very blunt and direct about it. Nobody wants to talk about it. It's impolite to talk about it. But so I wanted to share, especially with my children, obviously, for whom I also wanted to write these memoirs, to tell them this is exactly what happened in my life. So, and you know, at the end of the day, I reached the end of my career. I don't aspire for anything else. So nothing I do is going to make a difference. So why not just state the truth and then let people decide what it's about. And at the end of the day, I also hope that by describing how much adversity I faced as a child and how much adversity my mother faced with you, so that you can overcome adversity. And I find, especially for young Singaporeans, they get a bit traumatized when they experience a bit of adversity. And I want to tell them, hang on a second, actually experiencing adversity is what makes you as a person much stronger. But you cannot explain that adversity if you sugarcoat it. So I've tried to give it directly, brutally, what exactly I experienced, you know, as a child. Right from the, you know, the picking up my father from a drain to living in a house without a flush toilet. All these details, I think, bring out a bit of color and smell.
No, it's therefore it really does make it more engrossing, much more impactful as a memoir. And I certainly think that it will have that effect on the younger generation growing up without any, you know, that challenges in life that you had. Not to that extent, but I also had in growing up in a poor, war-destructed country, trying to get itself on its 2 feet again. South Korea, I think South Korea and Singapore share a similar trajectory of economic development and democratization. So let's now get to your life as it intertwines with the history of Singapore, right? And the transformation of Singapore at independence from a very poor country, literally, kicked out of the Malaysian Federation, and from that point in 1965 to where Singapore is today it's transformation. I don't think even captures the fullness of that change. And I have the sense South Korea also went through a similar experience, but at a certain point, as a South Korean, I feel we've stalled. I can't pinpoint exactly where. Yes, you have the K-pop cultures, the soft power, but as a country as a whole, we seem a little bit lost in many ways, going backwards. Whereas Singapore, you're still marching forward. And I think the younger generation of Singaporeans, I think many of them are here, also have that sense that we are going forward. What explains that?
Well, I was going to say, now you're beginning to sound like Kishore Mahbubani, because you're being very brutally honest in saying we in South Korea have stalled. That's very un-Asian, by the way. To admit that, you have problems and publicly is also very un-Asian. But you're right that South Korea and Singapore have had remarkably similar experiences, because South Korea and Singapore were almost equally poor. When Singapore became independent, our per capita income was $500, the same as Ghana, and I think South Korea was about the same also.
Oh, I think we were
around
a lot poorer.
Yeah.
Yes, maybe.
But I mean,
300.
both South Korea and Singapore were part of the four tigers that succeeded remarkably well. But in the case of Singapore, I also want to emphasize, and this is unfortunately factually true, even though what I'm going to say is outrageous, but it's true. No society since human history began has improved the standard of living of its people as quickly and as comprehensively as Singapore has done so. It's an amazing track record. Because, Singapore has gone from, at independence, a per capita income of $500 to now having a per capita income of $88,000, higher than the United Kingdom, the British, whom I thought was so superior to me. Now I look at them and say, maybe I should send them some help. Genuinely, the British need some help. And then, by the way, it's even higher than, amazingly, even higher than the United States, which is incredibly successful.
Are you now on a par with Switzerland, or?
I think we are in the top 5. So in the top, I think it's like Switzerland, Luxembourg, and maybe the Gulf countries, But for Singapore, the remarkable thing about Singapore is that we have no natural resources, zero. Absolute zero. It's the only thing that and the reason why this happened, and this is also a reason why I wrote this book, was because Singapore's founding fathers were probably as extraordinary as the founding fathers of the United States of America. They had 3 absolutely brilliant men, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, whom you saw up there, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, whom most people haven't heard of, and Mr. S. Rajaratnam, our foreign minister. And I had the great pleasure of getting to know all 3 of them quite well. As I explained in my memoirs, I spent a lot of time, sometimes one-on-one with these people, and you get to know people very well when you spend time one-on-one. And they were remarkable. And that explains the remarkable trajectory of Singapore as a country. And so one of the other reasons why I wrote this memoirs now is to tell younger Singaporeans, you got to appreciate the fact that you had extraordinary founding fathers. And sadly, you saw a picture of me receiving the President's Scholarship. Apparently, some of the recent scholars that Singapore sent overseas, when they came back to Singapore and they were interviewed, some of them didn't know who Dr. Goh Keng Swee was, the architect of Singapore's economic miracle. And that ignorance is what frightens me. And hopefully my book can help to sort of remedy that a bit.
But reading your book, I think, three extraordinary founding fathers, for sure. And maybe this is a reflection of their leadership, but what was impressive was how long-term thinking they had. And you talked about how you got to read the cabinet papers every Saturday, and that how you were amazed at the long-term strategic thinking that resulted in long-term strategic projects. The sewerage system, for example. So
you notice there's a lot of sewage references in my
what was that called? What was it called? Water treatment facility or something?
Yeah,
I think that was it.
New water, yeah.
So, that transformation from 500 to 88,000 is just emblematic of that long-term thinking.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think Singapore is the only country in the world, I suspect, where they're worrying about where they might be 50 years from now. Really. And certainly in terms of like mapping what climate change would do.
Yeah.
And Singapore is a very small island, right? I mean, we have nothing to fall back on. So we got to start building up our defenses for where we will be 50 years from now. And in some of the cabinet papers I read would talk about that, about what the world will be like for 40, 50 years and how we prepare for that and how what we need to do.
So,
and that kind of long-term thinking is actually nowadays rarer and rarer in most countries.
Rarer and rarer.
Yeah.
And so, which is why I asked, and you don't get to read the cabinet papers anymore, but
sadly.
if you were, and what would you say is the long-term thinking now? What kinds of initiatives or projects would they be thinking, or should they be thinking?
Well, I think it's, the reason why my book is called Living the Asian Century is because I do believe that the 21st century will be the Asian century. And again, the data confirms this, by the way. Yeah. What's remarkable about the United States has been clearly the most successful society since human history began. I mean, the amount of wealth that the United States has accumulated is amazing. And one of the most shocking statistics I came across was that in the year 2000, when the 21st century opened, the GNP, the economy of the United States, one country, was bigger than all the 52 countries of Asia. And the 52 countries of Asia included China, Japan, India. And guess what? United States was bigger than 52 Asian states in the year 2000. But that was an incredibly exceptional performance by the United States of America. But exceptional performances cannot last. You have to revert to the norm. And since the Asians make up 55% of the world's population, and United States makes up whatever it is, 5% of the world's population, at some point the weight of 55% is going to rise. And now already the combined GNP of Asia is at least 1.5 times bigger than United States. By 2050, it'll be 3 times bigger than United States. So, that's a natural return of the weight of Asia in the world. So in response to your question, what should Singapore think about? I think, in every century, let's say when the 19th century was the European century, London was the natural capital, right? The most thriving city. In the 20th century was the American century. New York was the natural capital of the American century. Arts, culture, economics, finances, everything. Now, if you look around the 21st century and you're looking for one city that could potentially be the capital of the Asian century, that city is Singapore. Because Singapore is the only city in Asia where all the 4 major civilizational streams of Asia flow through Singapore. Singapore is 75% Chinese population, so Chinese civilization. 15% Malay Muslim, Islamic civilization. 8% Indian, so Indian civilization. And then you have Western civilization, very powerfully embedded in Singapore because we didn't destroy the institutions that the British left behind. We built on the British rule of law and everything. So that positioned Singapore to become the natural capital of the Asian century. And so therefore, Singaporeans should therefore see themselves as playing a role, not just to keeping themselves prosperous and alive and doing well, but thinking of their larger regional responsibilities, how to help this region deal with the new environment. Because as new powers emerge, there'll be all kinds of challenges emerging also.
Yes.
And that's one thing that the founding fathers of Singapore were very good at. And I'll give you a simple example. When Singapore was expelled from Malaysia in 1965, I described how there was complete doom and gloom in Singapore. Everyone wept and said, Singapore has no future. Singapore is a city without a hinterland. And we were rejected by the hinterland, Malaysia. But guess what? You know what Rajaratnam did? Rajaratnam, one of the three brilliant founding fathers, he leapfrogged over our region and he said Singapore will be the first global city in Asia.
That was
in 1972.
72.
Can you imagine that? How far back? And his dream came true. We became a global city. So that's the kind of long-term thinking. And by the way, Singapore in 1972 was an incredibly poor third world developing country, where not all the houses had flush toilets and all that yet completely, So, it's amazing how far we have come. So even when we were that poor, we were thinking, we have become a global city. That's the kind of long-term vision you need. And that's what I think you need to have in Singapore today.
So this is the long-term thinking going on among the leadership now. Singapore
I cannot speak for the leadership.
Singapore becoming the center of the Asian century.
Yeah, right? That's what I would advocate. You asked me what I would advocate.
No, I think already it's happening because so many players are wanting to be in Singapore. Maybe Asian society should also. But there is a big challenge, and I think Singapore is feeling the same. The dropping fertility rates that is, find in all Asian countries, in particular East Asian countries, in particular in countries with a large population that is influenced by the Confucian cultural background. That's China, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and partly Singapore, all dropping fertility rates. And I explained that with the fact that these are all cultures that place a tremendous amount of value on education, educating your next generation with the best that you can give, so that they can succeed not just for yourself but for your family. And that drive has been what drove the economic successes, the human talent that went into the development. But now it's a huge drawback when young couples realize it's going to take so much to have children and to give them the education that can lead them to successes. And certainly that's what's happening in South Korea. I think maybe not to a similar extent, but to somewhat that element in all of these countries. And Singapore also is, I think, below 2.1. It has been for a long time. But you are already a multicultural country. You have many migrant workers. So how would you advise the Singapore leadership to deal with this? How would you advise other countries deal with this issue?
Well, I must say that, one of the reasons for Singapore's extraordinary success is that Lee Kuan Yew was an exceptionally brilliant politician. And in my book, I tried to describe how cunning he was and how he would always find creative solutions to many problems that Singapore encountered. But I must say, one problem that Lee Kuan Yew failed to solve was the fertility problem. He tried very hard. I never saw him work harder on any issue than the fertility issue. And sometimes he said things that were politically incorrect. He said something like, maybe monogamy was a mistake. No other political leader could say that and get away with it. Despite that, but it is, I must emphasize, it's a real challenge. But it's spreading around the world. More and more countries are having lower and lower birth rates, and Singapore is one of the lowest. The only slight advantage that Singapore has as a country is that, in Japan, for example, is a monocultural country. And it's very difficult for foreigners to be accepted in Japanese society. You're either Japanese or not Japanese, right? You cannot. I remember when my niece, my elder sister's daughter, was born in Japan, the Japanese emphasized in the birth certificate that she's not Japanese. They emphasized that in the birth certificate. But in Singapore, we are multicultural. So we are 75% Chinese, 15% Malay, 8% Indian. So we are used to diversity. And so when people come to Singapore from overseas and migrate to Singapore, it's easier to fit into a multicultural environment because it's a society that accepts diversity. But at the same time, I must emphasize that we do also have, this is shocking, anti-immigrant sentiment in Singapore. Quite shocking, it's there. And what is even more shocking is that when you have Chinese coming from overseas, it's the Singapore Chinese who resent them. And when you have Indians coming from overseas, it's the Singapore Indians who resent them. And that's bizarre. In theory, they are the same ethnic group, they should be able to get along. So it shows you that social integration is actually very, very difficult.
It is.
Very difficult. And we have developed tribal instincts, and we can smell when someone is a fellow member of our tribe or not a fellow member of our tribe. So, for example, Singaporean Indians and Singaporean Chinese quite often become very good friends, and there's a very large amount of intermarriage between Chinese and Indians in Singapore. And it shows you that there's a kind of a Singaporean identity developing. And so a Chinese, an Indian, or even a Malay coming from overseas would still have difficulty fitting in, although many of them do, I must emphasize.
No, I think the problem with Japan and Korea, who have traditionally been monocultural, mono-ethnicity, to open up now to other people coming in, it's difficult. So that's the mental block of the country going multicultural. Singapore is already multicultural, but you also say that there is an anti-immigration sentiment. I wonder if that has to do with the size of Singapore as a city-state. So you have this idea that it has limited space. Do you think that's... Yeah.
Very limited space. But at the same time, what I'm going to give you is a secret. We are actually quite expansionists. Singapore has reclaimed more land than I think any other country has, as a percentage of its territory.
And would that be an ongoing project?
No, there are limits, because we have neighbors, so we cannot grow. And we are very careful. We respect our neighbors. Whatever we do, we don't do anything that upsets our neighbors. But we have expanded our territory, and therefore you have urban planning in Singapore for the next 50 years.
Long-term planning.
And so they already set aside blocks of land, newly reclaimed land that is unused and kept ready and available. And also I must congratulate Singapore for its sort of like far-sighted thinking on land use. I give you a simple example. It is very expensive to reclaim land, by the way. Again, we are fortunate we have the money, we can do it. But when you reclaim expensive land, what do? You set up skyscrapers and you get tremendous economic return. You know what Singapore did? It took this very expensive land and created a whole new botanic gardens. You make absolutely no money from these botanic gardens, but it creates a sense of, happiness in your people. So we have this remarkable new garden set up on very expensive reclaimed land, which actually even the Financial Times said was one of the remarkable things that has happened in Singapore. We have a traditional botanic gardens in Singapore, which the British created, which is wonderful. It's really one of the best preserved botanic gardens in the world. And now we have a new one on reclaimed land. Why? City 50 years from now will need additional botanic gardens.
So I think this long-term thinking is increasingly difficult for countries that are swayed by populism. And I think that's the wisdom of your leadership is not being swayed by populist sentiments. And that enables them to go to the long-term direction. But let's now move on to, and I've already used most of my time on theme one, but we have two more themes, and then they're all both important. The second theme that we wanted to discuss is diplomacy. I mean, you've lived through many different geopolitical eras, from Cold War, post-Cold War, the unipolar moment, and now we're transitioning to a multipolar order. And clearly, diplomacy reflects that era. In Cold War, it was simple. I mean, you were split into two blocks, and you belonged to one block. You dealt with that block, and you rarely dealt with the others. I think diplomacy, in a sense, was easy because. But as you move towards a multipolar world, it becomes challenging to manage relationships, to undertake diplomacy that solves problems and disputes and shores up the forces for peace and not conflict. How do you see diplomacy evolving in this fluid era? And how is that different from the more stable? It may not has been peaceful, only cold peace, but it was still stable in a sense, and doing diplomacy in a stable world is different from doing diplomacy in an increasingly unstable world.
Well, see, fortunately, we can learn from the wisdom of the ages. And as you know, diplomacy is the world's second oldest profession. No relationship to the oldest profession, by the way. And the people who lived 2,000 years ago were smarter than the people who are living today. And I'll give you a simple example. In the old days, 2,000 years ago, when tribes or states would fight each other, they would then try to negotiate, and then they would send an ambassador to the enemy capital, and then the ruler would get angry and chop off the head of the ambassador. That stopped the negotiations, obviously.
Right.
So they realized, they came to the common sense conclusion, hang on a second, if we chop off heads of ambassadors, then clearly you cannot have diplomacy. So they created the concept of diplomatic immunity. And that's how it began 2,000 years ago, so that ambassadors could go into enemy courts and not get their heads chopped off. So diplomacy was always invented to talk to enemies, not to friends. Now, the reason why I say that there were people 2,000 years ago were smarter than us is that in the 21st century, well, at least here in the United States, you have the belief that before I can establish diplomatic relations with you, you got to be my friend. But you don't need diplomatic relations for friend. If you're going to a friendly court, your head is not going to get chopped off. But once you declare a country is an enemy, then you got to establish diplomatic relations. So therefore, logically, as you know, vis-a-vis North Korea, which the United States declares to be an enemy state, it should establish diplomatic relations. That's the logical thing to do. But you notice that it cannot be done because it's politically incorrect. And I'll give you another example of politically incorrect diplomacy. And my apologies to some of you if here I'm treading on sensitive ground. When you had the first meeting between Secretary Blinken and foreign ministers of China, Jiang Jiechi and Wang Yi. soon after the Biden administration was elected, I think in Alaska, And the meeting began with both sides attacking each other. And why did they attack each other? For domestic political reasons, right? But that's not what diplomacy is. The role, they say the definition of a diplomat is someone who can tell you to go to hell in such a way that you feel you're going to enjoy the journey. So all this shouting and name calling, that's not diplomacy. That's primitive. So 2,000 years ago, our ancestors were much smarter than us. They understood what diplomacy was. In the 21st century, we don't understand what diplomacy is. And when you talk about a multipolar world has been the norm since human history began. When you have a unipolar moment like the one between the end of the Cold War and probably the next 20 years, that was an aberration. A unipolar world, bipolar world are all aberrations. The 21st century will be a multipolar world. And in a multipolar world, you've got to deal with complexity. You've got to deal with people who think and completely different from you. And that's why you need to go back to the old tenets of diplomacy. So tenet number one, if you're my enemy, first thing I do, I establish diplomatic relations with you. So I can see you, talk to you face to face and understand what you really think. Because I can assure you, unless you are there in the enemy capital, talking to everyone, you don't understand how they really think. You got to be there. Whether it's Iran, whether it's North Korea, whether it's any country. And then at the same time, you got to accept the reality that in all good diplomacy is about compromise. If any country tries to get everything, it's not going to succeed. So they should make it a truism for diplomacy that if any country goes for total security, it is creating total insecurity. Because if you have total security, your neighbor, your counterpart is not secure. What you want is a situation where both sides feel secure. That requires compromise between US and China, between India and China, between North Korea and South Korea, between all countries. You need to have compromise and learn to live and give and take. And actually, you know what? They've been doing it for thousands of years, but we've lost it. In the 21st century.
We're increasingly incapable.
we have become very ideological as human animals. And especially in the West, there's a great desire to pass judgment on countries and say, how can I possibly establish diplomatic relations with the Taliban? Well, you have to establish diplomatic relations with the Taliban because they're different, right?
I think part of the challenge is the public scrutiny that wasn't there 2,000 years ago.
No, but the public scrutiny should be intelligent public scrutiny and should insist that at the end of the day, we are going to move into a much more smaller, more interdependent world. And I always use a simple boat analogy just to describe how the world has changed. In the past, when 8 billion people lived in 193 separate countries, it was as though they were 193 separate boats, right? And the proof of that was if one boat caught COVID, another boat wouldn't catch COVID. COVID cannot go from boat to boat. But now, the 8 billion people no longer live in 193 separate boats. They live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. So that's why COVID goes from cabin to cabin. All 193 cabins got COVID. Now, if you live in a small interdependent universe all together, it's not just about protecting your cabin. You got to protect the boat as a whole. You got to protect planet Earth as a whole. And now with climate change coming, the most important priority in diplomacy today should be, hey, first let's save our planet before we continue fighting each other. That should be the priority.
I completely agree on the need for that shared direction, a shared interest in tackling this existential challenge together. But I think intellectually we all understand that, but on a day-to-day foreign policy thinking and diplomatic practice, the short-term interest gets in the way, the short-term national interest. You mentioned India and China. We had the Indian foreign minister here just 2 weeks ago, and he exuded a great deal of confidence about India's rise. I think India is growing at 8% annually. Think of India growing at 8% for decades to come, and think how you're going to deal with that India, right?
Yeah, I noticed that the Asian Society only likes Indians. Jayashankar is Indian, I'm Indian.
No,
They're only Indians here.
No,
you should invite some Chinese also.
We welcome all Asian leaders.
I'm kidding.
No. But so we asked him about India-China relations.
Yeah.
China is not doing so well these days. It's a bit of an economic downturn that seems hard to overcome. But India-China relations is difficult, and how the two sides manage this will be a definitive influence on the rest of Asia, and the world perhaps. So how do you see that unfolding? How do you advise the two sides to manage this relationship?
Well, the way I describe it, I say that relations between China and India, they're not bad. They're very bad. No, seriously, I'm very, very worried. If there's one big thing that I worry about the future of Asia and about the future of the Asian century, is how these two Asian giants will get on, China and India. And actually, for most of the time, they were able to get along reasonably well. And indeed, when Prime Minister Modi came into office in 2014, I think, he had much longer meetings with President Xi Jinping than any other Indian leader had. And then, unfortunately, we had a very bad incident in Galwan in June 2020, where both Chinese and Indian soldiers lost their lives in a clash. And since then, relations have gone down. And I'm sure, as Foreign Minister Jayashankar hinted, relations are in a very difficult phase. So, but at the same time, if China and India look at it logically, they both have tremendous growth potential. You're right in saying that Chinese economy is facing some short-term challenges, but I can assure you 10 years from now, the Chinese economy will be much, much bigger than what it is today. And 10 years from now, the Indian economy will be much, much bigger than it is today. And a former Prime Minister of India, Manmohan Singh, once said very wisely, he said the sky is big enough for both China and India to grow together. So, and I think that's the case. It's a question of both of them having to achieve a new modus vivendi with each other. And I think it can be done. We'll have to go back to the old-fashioned diplomacy of 2,000 years ago, where you compromise and you can work things out.
And what about ASEAN in that mix?
Well, I think ASEAN is the most underrated organization in the world. It has performed absolute miracles, okay? It has taken the most diverse region of planet Earth, Southeast Asia. By the way, just take a mental tour, all of you, to Latin America, to Africa, to Europe, to Central Asia. Go any part of the world, you'll never find the kind of diversity as you do in Southeast Asia, where out of 700 million people, you have 250 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, you have Taoists, you have Confucianists, you have Hindus, and you have lots of communists also in Southeast Asia. 100 million of them. So, we have everything in Southeast Asia. It's the most diverse region. If there was one region of the world that was destined for war, it's Southeast Asia, right? And British historians call it the Balkans of Asia. But guess what? We've had, since 1967, the creation of ASEAN, we've had peace and prosperity. And ASEAN's economy has grown spectacularly. In the year 2000, Japan's economy was 8 times bigger than ASEAN. Now it's 1.3 times bigger than ASEAN. And by 2030, ASEAN is bigger than Japan. So this is a remarkable region. At the same time, to answer your broader question, ASEAN is playing also an important role of bringing other powers to come and talk to each other under the ASEAN umbrella. So you notice that the annual ASEAN meetings, which I think you attended, as you know them quite well, Keng Hua. You notice how when the ASEAN countries meet, they invite everybody, and everybody comes. And that's amazing. No other region attracts so many foreign participants as ASEAN meetings do. So it shows you the convening power that ASEAN has. And the first way, by the way, the first lesson in diplomacy is that you got to talk to each other. Nowadays, there's still many countries where the heads of state can't talk to each other. Whereas if you come to an ASEAN meeting, everybody talks to each other. That's what ASEAN does.
So this notion of ASEAN centrality, the first I came across it was almost the same time when this notion of the Indo-Pacific replacing the Asia-Pacific as a geographical framing of the order came about. And I think it was, in fact, Prime Minister Modi who said ASEAN centrality, the centrality of ASEAN in the Indo-Pacific. I first heard it from him, and then it became ASEAN's own term as it's spelled out as Indo-Pacific outlook. Is that more of the aspirational side of it? And I think it would be great for that centrality to have the strongest substance it can have in terms of the internal solidarity and togetherness. But there is a great deal of difference, economic difference, political difference within the 10 ASEAN countries, and now to be 11 to include East Timor.
Yes.
So how do you then internally deal with the diversity, the huge gaps, for example, in terms of the economic conditions of the countries?
You're right. ASEAN is the most diverse regional organization. And in fact, if there's one regional organization where members should be squabbling with each other, it should be ASEAN. But what's remarkable, there is very little squabbling within ASEAN. And I know I wrote a book called The ASEAN Miracle. And one thing, we still don't fully understand why ASEAN is successful, by the way. But one fundamental reason could be because of Indonesia. Because traditionally, most regional organizations fail because the largest member state tries to control the other states. I mean, it happens in the Organization of American States, OAS, which is dysfunctional, Whereas Indonesia, as the largest member state of ASEAN, hasn't tried to dominate ASEAN. But more importantly, within Indonesia, the most populous people are the Javanese. And the Javanese have this concept of musyawarah and mufakat, which means consultation and consensus. That you don't fight each other. You consult each other, you talk to each other, and you reach a consensus. And somehow or other, the Indonesians have planted the DNA of musyawarah and mufakat into ASEAN. So there's consultation and consensus within ASEAN. And ASEAN is a very loose organization. The reason why you had Brexit in the European Union is that the Europeans have a rule: you're either in or you're out. So you've got to abide by all the EU regulations, or whereas in the case of ASEAN, we are a bit more flexible. We say, if you're not happy, take a vacation. Come back. So, we have this ASEAN minus X principle. So if you cannot all agree, okay, maybe 7 of us agree, the 3 of you take your time. When you're ready, you can come and join us. So that kind of looseness and flexibility. So the European Union was wise. They should have given UK a vacation. and sure enough, the British people now deeply regret the decision. But because they're so rigid and legalistic, they cannot come back in.
Yes.
So this is where ASEAN can teach Europe some lessons.
Before I give the floor to the audience, I have to, of course, ask you about the current situation in the Middle East. I mean, we're talking about Asia rising, optimistic, but we have these terrible wars going on in other parts of the... And, of course, the headlines these days are all about Israel, Hezbollah, Lebanon, and Iran. How do you see this ending?
Well, I've been studying geopolitics for 53 years. And, and as you know, I make pronouncements on lots of subjects confidently, even though I may not know much about it. But I've decided very early on that there's one area which is a complete exception, which is the Middle East. Because in every other region of the world, I can try to understand the structural dynamics. And if I understand the structural dynamics, then I can more or less predict what's going to happen, right? The Middle East is a very strange corner of the world where if you can find the happy, peaceful way or the ugly, confrontational way, they'll always pick the ugly, confrontational way. I don't know why. For reasons I really don't understand. And that's why that region, in my 53 years of studying geopolitics, there have been more wars in the Middle East than anywhere else. Wars, skirmishes, all kinds of challenges and so on and so forth. And absolutely no movement towards any kind of regional harmony. It's the exact opposite of ASEAN, the Middle East. And so, but I don't understand this at all. I don't understand what in the cultural DNA of that region leads to the highest level of dysfunctionality. Whereby you cannot even have normal diplomatic relations among many countries. Which is the base. The base should be just normal diplomatic relations, especially among enemies. But that cannot be done.
I think there's a...
And by contrast, just to illustrate this, when I was ambassador here in the UN in the 1980s, I spent my 5 years arguing with the Vietnamese ambassador at every General Assembly, condemning Vietnam for its occupation of Cambodia, 1980s. You know what? By the 1990s, Vietnam, which had been fighting ASEAN for so long, joined ASEAN. I mean, that's amazing. That's a miracle, right? That's what we do in Southeast Asia. We take a long-standing enemy, we say, okay, now you're part of the family. That's it. That's something as simple as that. Can you imagine the Middle East doing this? That's why there's something wrong in the cultural DNA of that region. And anybody who makes predictions about what's going to happen in the Middle East is very stupid. Seriously, because you believe me, that region will continue to surprise you. Because when you think you hit rock bottom and things cannot get worse, Middle East will always produce another rock bottom. That's how bad it is.
In the meanwhile, I think there's so much resentment and the sense of victimhood on all sides that had become so deep. And so it makes it very difficult to find cool-headedness in the midst of all of that to work towards a solution. But in the meanwhile, you have people being killed.
Suffering, yes.
Suffering
very
on
sad.
a day-to-day basis. That's a rare moment when Kishore doesn't have an answer. But we have about 20 minutes for you to now ask Kishore questions or provide comments. So if there are hands raised, I will go to the young gentleman on the fourth row there.
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Adam DePico. I'm a student up at Columbia, SIPA. My question is sort of based in the Indo-Pacific. What is clear, the stakes have never been this high with the increased tensions between the US and China.
Sorry?
The stakes have never been this high with the stakes have never been this high with the tensions which have prevailed in the Indo-Pacific with the US and China.
US-China.
And my question sort of lies on what more can Singapore play in terms of a role to keep the guardrails of economic stability, given that if any conflict were to emerge, Singapore would no doubt be caught in the crossfires given the choke point of the Malacca Strait. Thank you.
Well, you're absolutely right. One of Singapore's biggest concerns is, not just Singapore's biggest concerns, by the way, ASEAN's biggest concerns, is being caught in the crossfire between US and China. And sadly, I hate to make this prediction because sadly, many of my predictions about the rise of Asia, fortunately, have been correct. But this is, I'm going to make an unfortunate prediction that the US-China contest will get worse over the next 10 years. The logic is already built in. It's very clear that, and the United States has been very open about this, that it cannot accept China as a peer. So the United States is going to try and stop China, and China is going to make sure it's not stopped, and that the contest will accelerate over the next 10 years. It's going to affect all of us. And so what the best that we can do is for ASEAN to stay united and for ASEAN to send a very clear message, which it has, by the way, so far, to say that, hey, we want to be friends with the United States, we want to be friends with China, we don't want to take sides. This is a contest within the two of you, but we don't want to be, get involved in this contest. And so far, that message seems to be understood in Washington, D.C., and in Beijing. And ASEAN, by the way, also does practical things to make sure that both sides understand that we want to be friends with both. So in the case of China, ASEAN's trade with China was only $40 billion in the year 2000. By 2022, it had hit $975 billion, almost $1 trillion. It was the world's largest trading relationship in 2022. So we're sending a message to China, we want to be friends with you. And on the investment front, United States has invested more in Southeast Asia than in China, Japan, South Korea, India combined. So we are telling Americans, we want you here. We want to be your friends. Mm-hmm. So that's the message that we in ASEAN are sending, and we try to be as clear and consistent about it, and we hope that that registers in both Beijing and Washington, D.C., and that they won't force the ASEAN countries, including Singapore, to take sides.
Look, the lady on the third row. Yes, there's a microphone coming. Yes, John.
Maybe if she stood up. Yes.
I'll be loud enough. My name is Shazia Rafi, former Secretary General of Parliamentarians for Global Action. Good to see you here again in New York, Augusta. I just wanted to ask a little bit from the experience that you had when you were on the Security Council many years ago, when the E10, were playing quite an important role in being able to deal with what is the main job of the United Nations, which is to maintain peace and security. And right now we are in a globe where two major wars are continuing to escalate, one which may even go beyond a regional war into something that is very dangerous. And the Security Council itself seems completely unable to get over the power and abuse of the veto, in a sense, being used, with its majority membership trying desperately but not able to move the council in the direction of enforcing some peace and security on both of these two regions. So I'd be interested.
Which two regions, by the way?
The war in Ukraine with Russia and the Middle East, both of which are, still raging, and that is the institution within that village council which the world is looking to, but it seems completely unable to do it. So I'd be interested in seeing, what given your experience when you played a much more important role where the E10 played a bigger role in the past, they seem to be unable to do so.
Thank you. Sadly, I thought that things were quite bad when we were in the Security Council in the year 2001, 2002, because we were in the Security Council in the build-up to the Iraq War. And the United States was trying to get the Security Council to endorse its decision to invade Iraq, and the Security Council then refused to do so. And by the way, the United States was opposed by its friends like France and Germany and on its invasion of Iraq. But it created divisions. But still, nonetheless, despite the divisions, they were still talking to each other. The ambassadors were incredibly civil and polite. And so you had Sergei Lavrov as the Russian ambassador, Jean-David Lavitte is the French ambassador, John Negroponte as the American ambassador, Jeremy Greenstock as the British ambassador, Wang Yingfan as the Chinese ambassador. But we could all talk to each other and have a conversation going and so on and so forth. And that's what diplomacy is, by the way. Today, I understand they can't talk to each other. I mean, it's that bad. I mean, you can't even have a civil conversation of any real kind. And that's why you have to now, I think the Ukraine war and the Gaza war, unfortunately, are going to carry on for a while until you get some kind of real exhaustion of the different parties. But it will also carry on because there's no conversation at all going on among the great powers in terms of any direct contacts and conversations with each other. But that's exactly why diplomacy was invented, is when you have as difficult a situation as Ukraine, is when you should talk to each other. And by the way, if you organize a diplomatic conference, don't get like-minded people to come for the conference, because that's never going to solve a problem. Diplomacy works when you're not talking to your friends, is when you're talking to your enemies. That's what diplomacy is about. So I sadly predict that things were not going to improve in the near future in these two areas, because there's no forces there trying to do something different.
Thank you. On the, I think about 8th row up with the lady on the 8th row, I think.
Thank you. My name is Barbara Jimenez, and I'd like to just go back to the Middle East for a moment and ask you whether you think part of the problem with a conversation between the parties in the Middle East has to do with a theocracy conversing with a secular society. And both the aims of the secular society and the theocracy are at total opposite extremes. How does that conversation work?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Can a theocracy and a secular state have a conversation? Well, I think if we're going to survive the 21st century, we have to have conversations between polar opposites. Because, you know, we are moving into a completely new era of world history today, where you're going to have the rise of clearly non-Western powers, clearly. I mean, India is a non-Western power, for example, you know. And we have to learn to deal with different cultures, different civilizations. And one thing we have been able to do, let's say in Southeast Asia, is that Vietnam, for example, remains a communist state, by the way, you know, still. And, you know, Indonesia is the world's most successful Islamic democracy. But they still talk to each other. The ideology doesn't matter. What matters at the end of the day is what are your core interests on both sides and how you reconcile your core interests. And, you know, at the end of the day, even though Iran is a theocracy, Iran is also has one of the oldest civilizations, Persian civilizations in the world. And I can tell you one of the most able diplomats I ever dealt with in my life was my then Iranian counterpart in 2000, whose name is Javad Zarif. And he, you know, is a remarkable diplomat, modern, sophisticated, you know, speaks a completely modern language. And I can tell you that when he was here, some members of some of my Jewish friends in New York said, "Kishore, can you arrange a meeting for us to meet Javad?" I said, "Sure." So I organized a meeting where they came to my house and they talked to each other. So I've seen a conversation in my house between an Iranian diplomat and members of the Jewish community trying to figure out how we understand each other better. That's what you need to do. Regardless of how different you are, you got to talk to each other. Regardless of how different you are. And paradoxically, even though Western culture prides itself on its openness, right? That's what liberalism is about. I'm open, I'm liberal. Actually, the Western mind finds it very difficult to deal with an other, which is very, very different. And strangely enough, we in Asia, we are surrounded by otherness. We are all different. I mean, Chinese and Indian civilizations are very different. Very different. And in Southeast Asia, we see the merger of Chinese and Indian civilizations too. But we learn how to deal with differences. We accept the fact that we are different. And that's what we need to have in the 21st century. And understanding that whoever the other is we're dealing with is going to be very different, but that's precisely the reason why we need to talk to each other.
Okay, let's go to this side. Any hands raised here? Okay, the gentleman on the third row at the end.
Good evening, Mr. Mahbubani. I just want to add on to what you said to this to the lady's question on having you have diplomacy with your enemies, not with your friends, to those who are vastly different to yourself. But I was wondering, what are your thoughts on top of that, bringing these very different actors together, both in diplomacy, but also on something on a higher level like economic development or scientific advancement? And I'm thinking about the example of when the Chinese came in and brought in the, and had and fostered rapprochement between the Iranians and the Saudis. That's what are your thoughts on that, and how that can be, and perhaps how that can be a successful solution to what's going on in Southwest Asia?
By Southwest Asia, you mean? Middle East. Middle East, oh, okay. You're right, you've got to find other ways and means of bringing people together. And I'm going to give you, by the way, please forgive me, my answer sounds frivolous, but it's actually very serious. Why did Southeast Asia succeeded? And I say Southeast Asia succeeded because of 3 4-letter words. One is basically, it's a 4-letter word beginning with F, is fear. We began, all of us were afraid of communist expansion, then we came together as ASEAN. Then we had luck. We had good leaders, amazingly good leaders in Southeast Asia, which is why Southeast Asia did so well. But the third 4-letter word, I'm going to spell it for you, is GOLF. And I'm serious. I want you to know that I'm serious. I played golf with my ASEAN counterparts. And I knew that if I had a difficult problem to solve, right? And I gave an example in the book, Kyung-Hwa, you've seen this. Singapore proposed the idea of an Asia-Europe meeting because, Americans are Europeans talking to each other, Asians and Americans talking to each other, Asians and Europeans are not talking to each other. Singapore proposed an Asia-Europe meeting. But in those days, in 1990s, there was still some rivalry between Malaysia and Singapore. So the then Prime Minister of Malaysia, Dr. Mahathir, said, since Singapore proposed it, I will oppose it. That was the problem. So what happened? I went to the ASEAN meeting, I played golf with my ASEAN counterpart, my Malaysian counterpart, Tan Sri Kamil. I played a round of golf with him, had a good game of golf, then we had a few beers. Then at the end of the beers, I said, Kamil, tolong, Malay word, help me. I said, I cannot get my promotion until you can persuade your Prime Minister to remove his objection. So Kamil, after very good friend, said, okay, Kishore, for you, I'll do it. Sure enough, he spoke to his Prime Minister and removed the opposition. And that's how the first Asia-Europe meeting came about. It was a result of a golf game. And I can tell you, in a game of golf, and I know there are many distinguished golfers here, you can find out about a person's character when you watch them play golf. Once a person kicks the ball out of the rough, I know who I'm dealing with, right? So, it's amazing. So, believe me, one reason why Southeast Asia hasn't had wars is because the chiefs of armies are too busy planning the next golf game. And I'm serious. And, if you can imagine a world in which Israelis and Iranians play golf with each other, believe me, it changes the chemistry significantly. So, this is where, diplomacy, I want to emphasize, is not new. It's been around for thousands of years. Our ancestors have found ingenious ways for us to get along. And that's what we need to do. We need to go back to the old ways of compromise, of dealing with people whom you don't like, and dealing with people whom you despise. But you have to deal with them. That's what life is about. And I think it can be done, And I hope this is why people, you mentioned Southeast Asia and Middle East, the people from the Middle East should just come and visit Southeast Asia and then see that the diversity in Southeast Asia is far more than the diversity in West Asia. Most of them, as you know, have one religion, Islam. Right? We have how many different religions in Southeast Asia? Yet we get along. So we have to go back to the past and understand the wisdom of the past and bring it forward into the 21st century.
Well, I'm just glad that I survived my diplomatic career without playing golf. But I completely agree that we need to revive the efficacy of diplomacy. It's hard. Because the public scrutiny is very harsh and against that. And I've heard from some ambassadors across the street where they're afraid of being seen together even. Never mind conversing. Being seen together because somebody will take a photo of you.
You're absolutely right. That's absurd.
It's absurd. It is absolutely absurd.
If you can't be seen with your enemy, then what's the point?
Right.
That's what diplomacy was not invented to enable you to talk to your friends.
You need to talk to your enemy.
Yeah. In fact, when you see and when you walk into a room, you see your enemy, walk straight towards him.
Which is what I did when I saw the North Korean foreign minister on the first sight.
That's exactly. But that's a good example.
So I think, Kishore, I think your wisdom, your public statements will certainly encourage future generations of diplomats to go into that direction, as hard as it is under current circumstances. But it's been a marvelous conversation, but I think we're out of time. But one last question I will take as my prerogative, and that is, what next for you? I think in your book you say the history of Singapore has to be told, fully and in an uninhibited way. And so I was wondering, is that your next project? As now a historian and academician, would that be something that you would perhaps already be doing? Or?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking a very good question, because in the last 7 years, I produced 5 books.
Yes.
And I've spoken about them in this hall, I think, also. I suspect another book is on the way.
Okay. And when that is out, you will certainly come and give us another talk.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Kishore.
Thank you.
偷偷告诉大家，我最近发现了新法宝 Royal Face 逆时奇迹系列，它有活肤露、全效精华，还有精华霜。尤其我皮肤比较偏干，所以我非常的注重保湿。保湿做得好，肌肤自然烹润。提亮肤色更年轻，抚平皱纹超有感，而且气色变好。用心保养，每天都更美一点。美吧。